My talk today, I'm going to talk about what I would call the deliberate destabilisation of Syria. Before we talk, can I just let you know a couple of acronyms that I'll use. The GCC is the Gulf Cooperation Council. That comprises the Gulf states of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, Oman and Bahrain. The other one that I'll use is the Arab League. The Arab League is a conglomeration of 22 Arab states, but most of the influence in the Arab League comes from the Gulf petromonarchies, again Saudi Arabia, Qatar. Qatar had leadership of the Arab League at the time of the destabilisation of the troubles at the beginning of Syria. So if we start, in 2011 the world witnessed a violent destabilisation of Syria. Evidence for this being engineered from outside the country is overwhelming. Domestic protests for change were quickly hijacked by those with a regime change objective in mind. So there were proposals for 2 pipelines going through Syria. I think they're probably incidental to the general desire of the West to destabilise Syria, but nevertheless I think they are important to recognise. So the first one we have, in 2009, Qatar asked if it could do a pipeline through Saudi Arabia, through Jordan, through Syria and out through Turkey to serve the European markets. Then in 2010, Iran put forward a request to build a pipeline from its Pars oil field up through Iran, through Iraq, through Syria and out again to the Mediterranean, again to serve European markets, energy markets. Syria went for the Iran option and refused to sign the Qatari option. Now this really annoyed the Qataris, their Gulf Arab allies and their allies in the United States and Israel. This was because not only would it give Iran access to European markets that they wouldn't have, but Iran tends to ally with Russia and things like that, so they would be excluded from the European markets. So as I say, I think it's a contributing factor. I'm not sure if it's the whole reason why the West decided to destabilise Syria. Then we go on, I think really why I think this is because there is evidence for the desire to destabilise Syria way before either of these pipeline projects came up. This is evidenced from a leaked WikiLeaks cable in 2006. It was written by the ambassador, the US ambassador then in Damascus. His name was William Roebuck, and he wrote this cable discussing how they could destabilise the Assad regime, the Syrian government. And Julian Assange calls the proposals in this cable Machiavellian schemes. So you'll see that this is the cable and it's to Tel Aviv, the Arab League, the EU, and I think that's quite indicative that a White House ambassador is including those recipients in his, a US ambassador is including those recipients.
United Nations as well.
Yes, but yes, I know, that's surprising, isn't it? A bit shocking. Anyway, so this is quoting from the cable. He says, as the end of 2006 approaches, Bashar appears in some ways stronger than he was in 2 years. The country is economically stable, internal opposition the regime faces is weak and intimidated, and regional issues seem to be going Syria's way. Nonetheless, there are some long-standing vulnerabilities and looming issues that may provide opportunities to up the pressure on Bashar and his inner circle, so they're looking to destabilise him. Roebuck then goes on to suggest ways to, and I'm quoting, knock Bashar Assad off balance. And he says that these moves to do this would be in the US interest. He then says, if we are prepared to move quickly to take advantage of the opportunities that may open up, we may directly impact regime behaviour where it matters, Bashar and his inner circle. He lists possible actions, possible things that he's suggesting the US government could do, and he says that you could create fissures in the Syrian government and society. The thing that I find most disturbing is that he suggested fostering the division between Sunni and Shia Syrian citizens. He said we have to play on any Syrian Sunni fears of Iranian influence in Syria. So that's quite a sort of a nasty thing to do. Anyway, so that was 2006. Then in 2007, the retired General Wesley Clark gave a talk at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco. He mentioned that 6 weeks after the September 11 attacks, 2001, he went back to the Pentagon and he visited some of his old staff members. One of his old staff members from the Joint Staff called him into an office and said, have you seen this? And Wesley Clark said, no, what is it? And he handed him a memo. And the memo said, outlined the US's plans to attack 7 countries in 5 years. That's 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq. Remember, this is 2001. Starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. So I think we can conclude that the 2006 cable from Ambassador Roebuck was going to be a softening up process of Syria to put in place the Pentagon's 2001 plan to finally attack Syria. So moving on to European ambitions in Syria, because it's not just the United States. We have last year, live on television, a former French foreign minister, Roland Dumas, described a meeting he'd had in London in 2009. And he said, I was in England 2 years before the violence in Syria on other business. I met with top British officials who confessed to me that they were preparing something in Syria. And Dumas went on to say that he declined an invitation to join in that project. But later on, the French President Hollande was still ready to take action in Syria, despite the British vote not to bomb Assad in 2013. So it shows France was still up there ready and willing, as we were, but the vote just went against it. Then we move on. Of course, we're talking about military intervention, but it's not necessarily just military intervention, boots on the ground, strikes from the air, that can cause damage in a country. This is illustrated by, this is a US government document, well, a military document, written for the Special Forces, US military Special Forces. It's a training manual, written in 2008. And it's unconventional warfare. It trains people how to use unconventional warfare. Now, quoting from the document, it says, the intent of US UW, which is unconventional warfare, efforts is to exploit a hostile power's political, military, economic and psychological vulnerabilities by developing and sustaining resistance forces to accomplish US objectives. It discusses dividing and weakening the organisational mechanism of the ruling regime with operations that attack and degrade enemy morale, organisational cohesion and operational effectiveness, and separate the enemy from the population. It states that unconventional warfare is strategically as important as traditional warfare, and it says, for the foreseeable future, US forces will predominantly engage in unconventional warfare. And I think to a very large degree, this is what we've seen in Syria. So much has been covert, and the calls for boots on the ground have been, oh, we haven't put boots on the ground, we haven't done this, but they're doing so much underneath, which, as they say, is just as strategically important. So going back to the beginning of the revolution in March 2011, it started on 18th March 2011, things moved on quickly, and the people that were protesting against Assad's government were joined very quickly by ranks of foreign fighters with guns, with military equipment. This was corroborated by this chap here. His name's Ali Hashem. He was a senior reporter for Al Jazeera. He was on the border between Lebanon and Syria in April and May 2011. He reported, well, he had footage that there were fighters coming over, and he was amazed at these fighters coming over into Syria with weapons. He took footage and he presented it to Al Jazeera, and they refused to show it. So he then, with other reporters, 5 at that time, resigned for the same reasons, but he resigned. He was a senior reporter. He'd worked for the BBC for 5 years. I don't know if that's good or bad, but anyway, it just shows that he was a real reporter. There was no reason for them to disregard his footage or his reporting. Anyway, after his resignation, he spoke to the Real News Network. This is a transcript from the interview that he gave to the Real News Network, so it's sort of a bit in his slight Arabic terminology. And he says, "Actually, I can't identify who's really supplying the arms, but we saw armed men just crossing the river, the Great Northern River, between Lebanon and Syria. That was in May. And even something similar happened in April, but it wasn't on camera. But in May it was on camera, and we had footage, and no one wanted to have them on air. I just saw with my eyes, and it was in the beginning of the revolution. It was just like 1 month and a half from the revolution. I was seeing lots of weapons, people with RPGs, people with Kalashnikovs, just crossing from the borders. And there were not 1 or 2, there were a big number. They were just dominating the whole village that we were on the borders with. So, the militarization of the revolution started early. Some of them were Lebanese, some of them were Syrians, but at the time it wasn't clear. After like 6 or 7 months, we started hearing about the Free Syrian Army, but at the time we didn't hear about anyone. It was just like those are armed men just crossing borders and fighting against al-Assad's army. It wasn't clear who they are and who they are backed by, who was giving them weapons, who was really pushing them to do this and that. So anyway, as I say, he resigned, and he said that the problem with Al Jazeera, which as you know is a Qatari-based and owned station, is that it is the Qataris. He said it's not the problem with the reporters, he said it is the Qataris, and he said you went around the Arab world and people just lost credibility, Al Jazeera just lost credibility. So what happened then? He said that at that time, April, May 2011, there was no such thing as the Free Syrian Army. That can be backed up by a WikiLeaks cable of December 2011. This time the WikiLeaks cable is it comes from a Stratfor representative. Stratfor is a global intelligence agency. And the cable is reporting a conversation the author had with US military. And the author writes, one US Air Force intel guy said very carefully, there isn't much of a Free Syrian Army to train anyway, right now anyway. This is December 2011. They said that the idea was to, hypothetically, is to commit guerrilla attacks, assassination campaigns, and try to break the back of the Alawite forces and elicit collapse from within. He also noted that, and I quote, Special Operations Force teams from the US, UK, France, Jordan, Turkey are already on the ground focused on recce missions and training operations. So that's your unconventional warfare coming into play there. So also what we've got to note as well, that there was no Free Syrian Army as such, it was just sort of this mythical thing. But in July 2011, a YouTube video was passed around YouTube, and it showed 7 guys in military uniform saying that they were the Free Syrian Army. 7 unknown people in military uniforms. So then the West picked up on this Free Syrian Army, making out that there was such a thing. But as I said, there was nothing really to describe that, even in 2011. So what happened was that the West tried to, in order for the West to sort of promote the idea of the Free Syrian Army and all this thing, they had to say that the rebels and everything were moderates. So we have the first moderate, and his name is General Jabbar al-Qadi. Here he is seen with US Senator Robert Ford, who was at that time the ambassador to Syria. This is in 2013. He not only later confirmed his support for ISIS, which he did in this quite lengthy interview where he talks about ISIS as brothers and says that they're not really, jihadists and they're quite nice chaps really. So not only did he do that in this, as I say, it's quite a long interview, but later he was filmed, and there's quite a lot of footage of this, with this ISIS emir, Abu Jandal. This was at the time when their joint forces, the FSA and this ISIS brigade, had captured Mena air base in Syria, north of Aleppo. So, and he's filmed congratulating them, saying that they're heroes and shouting Allah Akbar. So this is one of Robert Ford's lovely, moderate Free Syrian Army commanders. And there were lots that collaborated with ISIS, and collaborated with all sorts of Western-backed jihadis before ISIS came into prominence. But we can't forget this one. Now, this one was filmed in October 2013 and actually reached our media. And he is a US, NATO, and GCC-funded moderate rebel of the Free Syrian Army. And he's eating the heart of a Syrian Arab army soldier. So how can we say that they were moderate and then go on to push more and more and more to fight and arm and train them? It's really quite amazing. Of course, the thing that put the cap on it all really was the 2014 non-aggression pact that was taken between all the groups fighting in Syria, whether they were jihadist or moderate, and they decided they wouldn't attack each other because their common goal was to just remove Assad. So they came together as one under this non-aggression pact. But to go back, we have to look at how the Syrian revolution or destabilisation was sort of enabled. And we need to go back to the Libyan revolution. And for that, I've missed a page. Oh, no, I missed a page. We have to look at this chap. This is somebody called Abdel Hakim Belhaj. Abdel Hakim Belhaj was the Libyan rebel who collaborated with the UK, US, NATO, the GCC and Israel to a degree in the destruction of Libya. In 2004, he was rendered to the Libyan prison system by the CIA. He'd fought in Afghanistan and he was known to be a jihadi. So he was rendered to the Libyan prison system. And also in 2004, I don't know if you remember, Tony Blair and others in the West welcomed Libya back to the fold. And there was a great thing about welcoming Libya back to the fold. But at that point, Tony Blair and others convinced Saif al-Islam, who was Gaddafi's son, to start a program where you release political prisoners. So Saif al-Islam set up this program called the de-radicalization program, and he set that up in 2005. In 2010, under this de-radicalization program, Abdel Hakim Belhaj was released, and the next year he was heading the National Transitional Council's military wing in an armed campaign against Gaddafi's government. So that was very useful, wasn't it? This was fully supported by the likes of John McCain and Hillary Clinton, this guy that they persuaded Saif to let out of prison. Anyway, so that's in there with John McCain, and as you can see, he's quite well thought of by people in the West. When he'd managed to overthrow Gaddafi, Belhaj decided to expand his campaign into Syria. Ruth Sherlock of The Telegraph reported in 2012 from Tripoli that Belhaj secretly met Syrian opposition rebels in Istanbul. She said the new Libyan authorities had offered money and weapons to the growing insurgency inside Syria. And Mr. Belhaj also discussed sending Libyan fighters and to training troops in Syria. So Gaddafi's weapons stores were raided and funneled into Syria through Turkey, Tunisia and Lebanon. Patrick Coburn's article in The Independent in 2014 reflects that America had done its best to keep secret its role in supplying the Syrian armed opposition, operating through proxies and front companies. A leaked report by the US Senate Intelligence Committee disclosed an operation within the CIA in cooperation with the MI6 that arranged arms from Muammar Gaddafi's arsenals to Turkey through the long 600-mile Turkish southern border with Syria. That's that long border along the top. The report refers to an agreement early in 2012 between Obama and Erdogan, where Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar supply funding. Front companies purporting to be Australian was set up, employing US soldiers who were in charge of obtaining and transporting the weapons. The MI6 presence enabled the CIA to avoid reporting the operation to Congress as required by law, since it could be presented as a liaison mission. So then again, in September 2012, a Libyan ship carrying 400 tons of weapons docked in a southern Turkish port, and the man who organised that was Abdel Hakim Belhaj. Ironically, the former NATO-backed Abdel Hakim Belhaj now heads ISIS in Libya at the town of Sirte, which was Gaddafi's hometown. So the insurgency needed some sort of credibility and legitimate organisation. So the West decided to consolidate the Syrian National Council and build up a group called the Syrian National Council, and it came into being on October the 2nd, 2011, and shortly started to collaborate with the fledgling Free Syrian Army in December 2011, although there wasn't much of a Free Syrian Army. Both the Syrian National Council and its military wing, the Free Syrian Army, have roots in the Muslim Brotherhood. The Washington Post in May 2012 sort of muses on how moderate the Muslim Brotherhood is. I think that's, yeah. And it sort of is celebrating the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood is gaining influence in the anti-Assad revolt. And it says, exiled Muslim Brotherhood members and their supporters hold the biggest numbers of seats in the Syrian National Council. They control its relief committee, which distributes aid and money to Syrians participating in the revolt. The Brotherhood is also moving on its own to send funding and weapons to rebels. And then it goes on, Muslim Brotherhood would support the NATO intervention to help the opposition topple Assad. It has published a manifesto outlining its vision of a future democratic state. So the Washington Post is all on board with the Muslim Brotherhood, thinking they'll be democratic, and it's amazing. But anyway, I don't think what we see is that the US recognised the Muslim Brotherhood and other jihadi groups were driving the insurgency in Syria, even in 2012. This is a released Defence Intelligence Agency report from 2012, and it says the Salafists and the Muslim Brotherhood and the AQI, which is Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which went on to become ISIS, are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. When the Muslim Brotherhood gained control of the Free Syrian Army and took it over and sort of consolidated what there was, brigades joining the newly formed FSA began to take on religious names instead of names of areas or national figures like before. So it just shows that they were sort of insinuating a sort of a religious and Islamic thing even then. The Muslim Brotherhood in Syria is backed by Qatar, Turkey, because Turkey has a Muslim Brotherhood government under Erdogan, and these are huge players in the destabilisation of Syria. A Reuters report refers to this, and it talks about a Turkish nerve centre that's in a town called Adana, which is 60 miles from the border just there. Adana houses the Incirlik US-Turkish air base, And it was described as a clandestine Middle East-run nerve centre working to topple the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, again in sort of glowing terms. This nerve centre enabled the early strike against the Assad regime in Damascus in 2012, when it killed a lot of people, including 4 key Assad aides and the defence minister. Information leaked a couple of years later revealed that it was actually an American-Turkish plan, this attack in Damascus, and it was designed to overtake Damascus, but it didn't actually quite work. John McCain went to visit the Free Syrian Army commanders in 2013, wanting to encourage the United States to arm them even more. But in fact, the International Business Times revealed that they'd been already arming them since 2012. It said that CIA operatives and the US Special Operations Troops, again, Special Operations Troops, have been secretly training rebels with anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons since last year, months before President Obama approved plans to begin directly arming them, according to US officials and rebel commanders. So what we're hearing on the media and what they're finally coming out with in the news is actually, it's been happening already. They've been doing it already. It's just a nicety that they might let us know. So then we go on. So the US were arming rebels in 2012, and the New York Times actually acknowledges this in October 2012 and says that American officials were bemused as to why so many arms were going to jihadis. So if they realised this, and this report covers this, why did they expand and increase the programme in 2013? In 2013, the New York Times reported, with help from the CIA, Arab governments in Turkey have sharply increased their military aid to Syria's opposition fighters in recent months, expanding a secret airlift of arms and equipment for the uprising against Bashar al-Assad. Again, sort of glowing terms, but researchers from the Stockholm Institute of Peace Research described this new airlift as a coordinated clandestine military logistics operation. David Petraeus, who I've been told isn't the brightest of the bunch, but apparently he was CIA director until November 2012, and he was said to be the one instrumental in organising this aviation network and cajoled other countries to join it. American officials said that they were regularly confirmed that White House was regularly briefed on the shipments. So, apart from the covert arming, funding, supplying, training, funding, supplying of weapons to militants, what other tactics has the West used to undermine Syria? Well, sanctions are quite useful. There's other reports from the Washington Post and things about weapons and aids going to the rebels. So sanctions. The US, the Australians and the Arab League under Qatari leadership had sanctions in place, and the EU imposed sanctions on the 10th of May 2011. The sanctions are still in place, and they represent sanctions on food, gas and oil, electricity generating capabilities, banking, insurance and travel, but probably most importantly on raw materials required for drug production. And that's left many hospitals and many patients lacking vital medicines. Food prices have risen 300%. There was a uniform blanket sanction on all weapons going into Syria from the EU. Until 2013, France and Britain worked to overturn that. They pushed for the removal of these sanctions so that they could arm the Syrian rebels. The two key proponents of this were William Hague, our Foreign Secretary then, and Francois Hollande. And in 2013, they did successfully overturned that sanction, and the EU was then allowed to arm the Syrian rebels. All the other sanctions stayed in place. All the sanctions of arms and things going to the Syrian regime stayed in place, but the EU was now allowed to send arms to the Syrian rebels. William Hague said at the time, "This is the outcome the United Kingdom wanted." It did in fact actually turn out that President Hollande had, despite the EU embargo, been sending arms to Syria a year before, and he let it slip in an interview that France had delivered cannons, machine guns, rocket launchers, anti-tank missiles, all to the forces fighting Bashar al-Assad, even though he claimed that he hadn't done so until the embargo was lifted. So the other thing, coming back to destabilising Syria, another very, very effective tool in destabilising Syria is the media. The media has played a really insidious role, and Syrian journalist Ala Ibrahim, who was in Dara in April and May 2011, he said if it hadn't been for the media, all of the troubles would have been over in 2011. It would have just stopped. But as I say, we've discussed Al Jazeera and their emission, their reporting emissions, and Der Spiegel discussed that as well, saying that in 2013 that key staff members had left Al Jazeera. Reporters and anchors in cities like Paris, London, Moscow, Beirut and Cairo had left, despite they had luxurious working conditions in centrally located offices, typical of the Qataris to fund that. One of those that left was a German correspondent for Al Jazeera called, he's a Syrian, born in Damascus, called Akhtar Suleiman. And he said, "Before the beginning of the Arab Spring, we were a voice for change. We are now a platform for critics and political activists throughout the region. Now Al Jazeera has become a propaganda broadcaster." But it's not just Al Jazeera, it's Al Arabiya, which is this Saudi-funded one, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. They've all been guilty of misrepresenting and quite often lying about what's happening in Syria. The BBC recently used photographs of some people who weren't Syrian in situations which weren't in Syria, of people starving, and saying that they were people from the town of Madaya, the Syrian town of Madaya. But also, one of the key lies, I think, by the BBC is a panorama programme broadcast in 2013 called Saving Syria's Children. It portrayed a chemical attack on a school, and even an FSA commander in the area at the time, and the FSA has got no agenda to speak for the Assad government, and he said that this attack just did not happen. But the BBC felt that it was okay to do this programme. And Robert Stewart, he's a media analyst, he's actually done loads of investigation on this, and he's going to be presenting a talk in Frome on March the 1st for Frome Stop War. So I hope if you're able to, you can come along and see him. But it's also going to be in Bristol, so he's really worth listening to. So in conclusion, there's been lots of things that have destabilised Syria. Media, logistics, keeping borders open that should have been closed, all sorts of things, and it's all an arsenal of tools in the regime change toolbox of the West and their allies, and it has to be exposed and it has to be stopped. Okay, thank you.